This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight is an American veteran professional journalist, independent, I might add. She has 35 years in print and broadcast newsrooms. She's a regular on Yahoo News, Counterpunch, Truth Out. She partners with our friend Rick Walker on Maverick News from Canada. And she has, and there's others that she's a regular, including the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. She has her own podcast called Strange Bedfellows on Rumble. Lori Spencer from Norman, Oklahoma, welcome to the show.
Hi, Regis. Great to see you. Thanks for having me today.
It's been a long time in coming. It's been months since we've tried to hook up.
I know.
So I'm really glad. I'm really glad to have you. I
The
know
time
it's early.
difference. Yeah, the time difference makes it difficult. It's
Oh
early
my God, I
morning
know.
here.
Yeah, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. I know, and it's like 2 o'clock in the afternoon here. It's always a problem. All right, let's get right to it. The big news for many people here where I live in Crimea and the Russian Federation is that the United States Congress refused to give Zelensky more money. This was on his trip to Washington, D.C. He had hoped to speak again before the joint session of Congress, but was refused. He basically went home empty-handed and then went to Canada. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Because of this, McCarthy was ousted as Speaker of the House, and the Republicans now are looking to find somebody who will oppose any further spending. But on top of that, Biden is like tripling down.
Mm-hmm.
It is said that he is scheming to find another $100 billion to send to Ukraine. Lori, from your position, where you're sitting, what's your take on all of this?
I think it's pretty remarkable and long overdue. But you have to remember that for the longest time, all the Republicans, with the exception of a small minority, always voted for more support, more aid for Ukraine. So this was a major turning point. We're starting to get more votes to turn against the Ukraine spending. And to be honest with you, I think the reason for that is it's an election year. And they know that this war is increasingly unpopular with the American people as we see our country falling apart, our infrastructure falling apart. The tent cities under every bridge are getting larger. Our homeless problem, our border problem. We have so many major problems in this country that are not being attended to, and we would like to see our money spent on those things rather than on a war that most Americans can't even find Ukraine on a map. To be honest with you, most Americans don't care about this war. When you look at the polls and the top issues that are on the minds of voters in this election year, foreign policy, and that includes the war in Ukraine, rates less than 2% on the minds of Americans. So, a few Republicans in Congress figured that out and decided to put their finger on the pulse of America at last. And I, for one, was overjoyed to see Matt Gaetz on the floor of Congress last week, raising hell about it. And, I was glad to see McCarthy go. It's about time.
Okay, we're talking politics here because I agree. I think there's an election that's on the horizon. In fact, all of the contenders are now campaigning. Robert F. Kennedy, who is working for his campaign, I guess as a volunteer, he's decided not to run as a Democrat, but an independent. He is railing against many of these same issues. This funding for Ukraine, he'd like to see a peaceful end to this conflict. I don't think there will be one. And then you have Donald Trump and others who are savagely attacking Joe Biden and his administration. Trump is bragging that he'll end this thing in 24 hours. The other candidates are also pretty much against Biden. Some of them still favor more aid to Ukraine. But give me your thoughts on Kennedy, who's definitely, I think, going to take votes away from Biden. Trump, who right now, in spite of all the bullshit legal problems that they're throwing up in his face, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the DNC, I think if they held the election today, he would win just on these critiques of Joseph Biden and the war in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, the polls agree with you. All of the polls that I've seen quite recently show that Trump has a pretty substantial lead over Biden, 3 to 5 points, depending on which poll you look at. So that's close, but he's pulling ahead. Now, Kennedy coming into the race as a third party or independent candidate is the wild card. And what everyone's wondering right now is, who is he going to take votes from the most? Who's he going to hurt the most? I think he's going to take a lot of votes from Donald Trump. I actually think he will take more votes from Trump than he will from Joe Biden. Most Democrats in this country really don't like Bobby Kennedy. The Democratic Party doesn't like him. They don't agree on the issues at all. And a lot of them think Kennedy's a wacky conspiracy theorist, an anti-vaxxer, and every bad thing that that he could possibly be. But the Republicans really, really like him. I know a lot of Trump voters myself. I'm here in Oklahoma, in the heart of Trump country. And when I talk to my neighbors, most of whom voted for Trump twice, they're taking a good long look at Robert Kennedy, and they really like what they see. So Trump should be worried about Robert Kennedy. And, you know, this is going to be a sea change in American politics. Today, Robert Kennedy is making a very important announcement, as you know, in Philadelphia, in the cradle of American liberty. And I can't disclose what he's going to announce, but let's just say it'll be big news. And yes, most people are expecting him to turn independent or third party and to divorce the Democratic Party, which has been his party all his life. But he's leaving because this party doesn't like him, doesn't want him. They've already sent him every signal that they possibly can that they don't want him, and they're rigging the primaries to make sure that he can't get a fair shot. So there's really only one thing to do, and that's leave. And mind you, the Kennedys have been Democrats since the 1930s. You know, his grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, worked in the FDR administration. It would be a huge thing for Kennedy to leave the Democratic Party, and he really didn't want to. When he got into the race, he was hoping to clean up the mess that's the Democratic Party. He was trying to reform it, but he soon found out 6 months in the race that it's just impossible. You can't fix the Democratic Party. You can't change the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party changes you.
Yeah, well, I've been one of those people who has not participated in elections in the United States since Barack Obama. Just he turned out to be a chameleon. You know, you listen to his words if you wish, but watch what he does.
Right.
And he is a consummate liar. I think the worst president the United States has ever had. I think he's a fascist. He's a globalist. And well, and so I'm just saying, I don't participate. I haven't participated in elections, and I think they're fraudulent. I think this whole idea about electronic voting and mail-in votes is so easy to rig, and it's been proven. I think Donald Trump proved it, but they attacked him so viciously. My personal opinion is that I think that he beat Joe Biden in that election. And I'm not a Trump advocate by any means.
Right.
But
Right.
this is my question. Do you think that with Robert Kennedy and Trump, the two, I think, best well known, they have name recognition, do you think that they will make this issue of Ukraine and the war and funding to Ukraine the major foreign policy issue in the election and in the debates going forward? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you that Bobby Kennedy certainly will. I know that it's one of the driving reasons why he's running for president right now. And to Trump's credit, and I'm obviously not a Trump voter, but to his credit, pretty much every video he's been putting out lately, every statement, especially since we've seen things, heat up in the Middle East, we've seen Israel declare war on Hamas. Trump is just trying to stop a nuclear war. To his credit, he's making it clear that the more this escalates, it's World War III, folks. And that's something that he does not want. I will say that Trump has always been anti-nukes. He has a strong track record on that. He fears nuclear war, and he just wants to, as he says, stop the killing over there in Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East. I will say Trump was a president of peace, and he did keep us out of war. So I think that that's why we're going to see a groundswell of support for Kennedy and for Trump in this race. And Joe Biden's policies are failing, and he doesn't seem to care.
I don't think Joe Biden knows where he is most of the time.
That's right. That's
And
right. I think Joe's just taking orders.
I think I'll tell you this. Here in the Russian Federation, ordinary people, look at him as a joke. They say you must be so embarrassed, and then they all know, and this is coming from the Russian Federation from the very top, whether it's Putin speaking or Medvedev or Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for the foreign ministry, they are all declaring that Joe Biden is not in charge, that there are powerful forces above him and everybody else in his White House that are calling the shots. The people here know that. Now, I really didn't want to get into American politics because it's not my area of interest, really. I'm concerned about what's happening in America. But I was very disappointed with Bobby when he first came out. He was condemning Russia, the same old bullet points. Putin is an assassin. Right. I communicated with his campaign, tried to. I communicated with people who are friends of his and have access to him. And I said, he's got to change the narrative because he's got it all wrong. I encouraged him through others to look at the history of the provocations of the United States against Russia. And I will go back to World War II, but especially since Ronald Reagan and the evil empire, the soulless country, Americans have been so propagandized that I thought, Bobby, you should know better. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to debate this now with you, but it was just, I know he's changed his tone a bit, but it really troubles me as somebody who's spent the last 8 years trying to find out for myself what Russia is really like.
Exactly.
And I came here to finish a film, my film 30 Seconds to Midnight, which was basically about the fear of the imminent existential threat of nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And I found nothing at all like what I had been taught all of my life about Russia. And Russia is not the Soviet Union. I'd like a couple of quick thoughts from you on Bobby's current policy and statements about Russia and the war in Ukraine.
Sure. When he first entered the race as a Democrat, Perhaps he was just saying what he thought he had to say. Let's remember, we are in a new Cold War. And in the United States, unfortunately, nobody is going to get elected dog catcher if they say nice things about Russia, if they praise Russia, if they take the side of Russia, which is terribly unfortunate, but it's a reality of our politics, just as it was during the Cold War of the 20th century. Certainly no pro-Soviet politician would get elected to anything. So he has to temper his comments. He has to be extremely careful what he says. I too was extremely disappointed when I heard him say things like Putin is a thug, Putin is a criminal. And the main reason that I objected and the argument that I made to Bobby was, look, whoever the next president of the United States is going to be, if you say that you're a man of peace and you want to end the war, you're going to be in the role of mediator between these two warring nations. You can't really take sides when you're a mediator. You have to be fair. You have to be fair to both sides. You have to show compassion and understanding to both sides. How can you possibly sit down at the negotiating table with the guy that you just called a thug and a criminal? That's not going to work, is it, Bobby? So, maybe he gave that some thought. He has dialed those comments back. And, he's had several pro-Russian commentators on his podcast, people like my friend Scott Ritter, Colonel Douglas McGregor. They tend to favor Russia in this conflict. I think he has to be careful in an election year in the United States. This is a new Cold War, unfortunately.
What I had suggested, Lori, that Bobby Kennedy ought to do what his uncle did and have that back channel communication with Nikita Khrushchev at the most critical moment in the history of the world at that time. And he ought to somehow get the message across, whether it's a messenger like his father did, like his uncle did, and then direct contact with Vladimir Putin and say, look, this is what's going on. This is what I'm trying to do. If I'm elected president, you and I can work together, just like Nikita and my uncle did, to preserve life and humanity on this planet. Those are amazing days. And I had hoped that Bobby Kennedy might do something like that. And I can tell you this, if he were elected, and whether he is elected or not, I think that he should come to Moscow and meet with Putin.
I do too.
And just like his uncle said, Ich bin Berliner, he should say, Ja, Russia. Those are my feelings, because I lived through that whole period.
Yeah.
I'm 78 years old. I remember distinctly what was going on. Anyway, let's move on, because there'll be a lot more to say about the American elections coming up. And
I hope that happens too, Regis. I honestly, truly do. I hope that he has a back channel open right now. What I've been saying all along is to all of the presidential candidates, to Trump, to Biden, and to Bobby, is, they're all promising peace after the next election. Trump says he'll end the war in 24 hours if he's elected, in January of 2025. What I've been saying all along is, why are you waiting that long? I mean, you've got a phone. You've got your own plane, Mr. Trump. You're the only politician in the Western world who has not flown over there to Ukraine to visit Zelensky. And while you're there, why don't you go over to Moscow and meet with Putin as well? Is there any reason why you can't just pick up the phone? If you don't want to fly there, we've got this thing called Zoom. You could just do a Zoom call or something, anything, some kind of dialogue. Why are we putting it off while hundreds of thousands more are going to die between now and January of 2025?
if anybody could pick up the phone and talk to Vladimir Putin, it's Trump. He already
Yep,
knows him. They've had many conversations,
exactly.
formal, informal, private. Uh, and I wouldn't be surprised if Trump has been on the telephone with Vladimir Putin. But that's another
Everyone's
topic.
afraid, though, Regis, that these American politicians, they're all terrified to be seen with Putin, to let it be known that they might have spoken to Putin. They're terrified to pick up the phone. And after everything they did to Trump, right? I mean, they impeached him over this Ukraine stuff
Yeah,
back in
yeah, yeah. The telephone
2019.
call, unbelievable.
Yeah, Russiagate and all that. I mean, they scared Trump back into his corner. He's terrified to speak to Putin now, which is unfortunate.
Well, we're talking about Putin. Last Thursday, at the plenary session of the Valdai Discussion Club in St. Petersburg, Putin gave what I think is the most important speech he's ever given. I've listened to so many of them. I've watched so many of his press conferences with hundreds of foreign journalists. The speech that he gave at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 made him America's public enemy number one. What he did on Thursday, Lori, I watched it live. I had somebody translating for me. I then watched it again with subtitles, and I copied and saved his entire speech written. And as I've looked at that, what I came away with was this, and I'd like your opinion on it. Putin made 6 or 7 major points. One of them, he talked about a civilization view of the world. Now, I believe it was President Xi in China who first came up with that. It was a respect for the different civilizations, many of them ancient on this planet, a respect for them, for their culture and their values. Putin went on to talk about the importance of the sovereignty of every country, large or small, on the planet. He talked about their independence. He talked about their right to develop and to be assisted in their development. And Putin has been talking for months. Actually, it's more than months, it's over a year, about the new emerging multipolar world. Putin has said the American unipolar world and America as a hegemon is over. Putin has emphasized that the history, the culture, the language, and the religions of every country on the world must be preserved and respected. Lori, I did not at first take this as a direct affront to the United States. What I thought it was a direct affront to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, whose goal and pursuit is one world government, one world religion if they're going to allow it. And he says that you all will have nothing, but you will be happy and you will eat crickets or bugs. Lori, that was my take on Putin's speech. And for that reason, I think it was the most important speech that anyone has articulated, certainly in the last decade and maybe longer.
Well, I'm a big fan of Putin's writing, and his speeches are always brilliant. And every time he gives a major speech, I always say, that's the best speech he's ever given. And then the next speech is the best speech he's ever given. I thought his speech and his plenary session at Valdai last year was brilliant. I didn't think that could be topped. And then he did top it this year. And yes, it was in his own eloquent way, showing that they have, a growing coalition of nations. More than half the world is now in the opposite camp of the United States and NATO. And he kind of drew that line in the sand, did he not? Without being belligerent, without being provocative. That's what I like about Putin. He's still kind of leaving the door open for talks. And many people say they wonder why he would even bother to talk to us at this point. I mean, how do you talk to crazy? How do you negotiate with crazy? And he said that in one of his recent speeches about Joe Biden. He was like, how do you talk to this guy? He's clearly not in his right mind. This isn't someone that we can negotiate with. And yet he still has not slammed the door on negotiations. So I thought that was significant. And something else that really jumped out at me about his address at the Valdai Forum was I heard, and I don't know if you heard it this way, but in the past, he's always been careful not to praise the old Soviet Union at all. And he critiques it a lot. But at Valdai this time, he came closer to that than I've ever heard him say, that there were many good things about the Soviet Union. Wasn't saying that we should bring it back, but he was saying that we should not be ashamed of our history because, ever since Khrushchev made the secret speech in 1956, the Russians and the Soviets were always being shamed, by the West for their, for being communist and for their Soviet history. And yet there is much to be proud of. And certainly in the 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, there was always that feeling from the West that they were supposed to be ashamed of it. And I say, hey, you guys beat the Nazis. That's something to be proud of. You went in less than 100 years from a peasant nation to a major industrial world power, a superpower, a nuclear power. All of that happened under the Soviet Union. Why not embrace your history? And it was good to hear Vladimir Putin say that at last.
Well, having lived here now for 3.5 years and been coming here since 2016 to find out as much as I could about the truth about Russia, the Soviet Union. I'm living with people, and most of my friends are of the Soviet era. Mm-hmm. They either were in school at that time or adults, and they all look back on that period as a really good time, mm-hmm. because everybody was equal. Right. Everybody had a job. Everybody had the right to education all the way through PhD if you had the smarts to do it. That's right. Stalin, who's been excoriated in the West, he's the one that brought agriculture and industry to the Soviet Union, to modern-day Russia.
That's a fact.
And I have to say this. When I first came here in 2016, it's no understatement. I was blown away. I mean, it's not an overstatement. I was blown away. I went to Moscow, and I thought I would see this dilapidated, dirty place. It is more modern, larger than any place I've been in the United States, including New York City and Los Angeles, California. It is more incredible than Tokyo, and I've been there. It's more incredible than any city in the European Union, across Union, and I've been to most of them. I thought Russia was going to be communist. It's not a communist country. It's a capitalist country with a different kind of capitalism, but all the major brands from across Europe and the United States were all there. All the major automobiles manufacturers from Japan, from Sweden, from Norway, from Czechoslovakia to the United States. There's even Chevrolets over here.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. A lot of the taxis are Chevrolets.
Wow.
And they're pretty good cars. They're pretty good. They're manufactured here. So what I'm trying to say is, And in response to what you were saying about Putin, he said at one time that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a huge mistake.
Yes.
What he did not mean was communism. He did not mean atheism. He's a Christian himself, and he practices the religion.
Yes.
What he has constantly referred back to, as you and I have been talking about, were the values that go back centuries. And to this day, he continues to talk about that. So I think that it's unfortunate where the relations between the United States and Russia are today. They've never been as bad, never been as dangerous as they are. But as you pointed out, Putin continues to be conciliatory. He continues to be patient and not reacting to the daily increasing in number and kind of provocations of the United States and NATO, not on his borders anymore, but in the Russian Federation.
Within
right
his
here,
borders.
right here in Crimea, where I
Yes.
live. The
Right.
attacks have been daily and numerous, and he has shown so much patience not to further escalate this crisis. I think when I look at the world stage, Vladimir Putin has no equals. President Xi is a very powerful and a very enlightened leader, but he does not have the charisma and he does not have the presence on the world stage that Vladimir Putin has. So
True.
I think, and I'm happy that you know this much about Putin and you've followed him and that you appreciate who he is.
I do.
What I would like to add is this. While Putin always maintains a sense of dignity and patience and political politeness, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, is coming across as the bad cop.
True.
Medvedev has been blatant. He has been just excoriating the United States.
Every
Forget
day on
NATO.
Twitter.
Every day, everywhere.
Every day.
And I liken this to Lori, like your thoughts on it. I've thought this now for almost a year since Medvedev really has changed, because he was really a Western liberal leaning
Right?
capitalist in a sense, but he's changed. And I describe Putin and Medvedev as listening to stereophonic music. Putin is the left channel, Medvedev is the right channel. A lot of people might think that he is unhinged and rogue. No such thing would ever happen in the Kremlin. Your thoughts on that, Lori?
You know, that's interesting. I've heard a variety of opinions about this. Is it a good cop, bad cop thing? Are they coordinating this so that, Dmitry can say the things that Vladimir Putin cannot say? That's kind of an interesting road to go down. And, sometimes I wish that Dmitry would tone it down. Sometimes it's a bit much. I'm wondering if that kind of rhetoric is only making the world situation worse. But I remember him when he was pretty mild mannered and, like you said, more like a corporate liberal. So this new Dmitry, I'm not quite sure what to make of him, but I love his tweets. I follow him on Twitter and I always get a good laugh out of him. I honestly do. But yeah, there are those moments when I go, I don't know if I would have said that. Dial it back a little, Dmitry. We all have nuclear weapons here. Let's be careful.
I can tell you, my own belief is there's nobody that speaks for the Russian Federation, whether it's Lavrov, Maria Zakharova, who's the spokesperson for the foreign ministry, whether it's Shoigu, who's the head of the Russian Defense Ministry, These people do not go off script. And I do not believe that Medvedev is a rogue person just going off script. I just don't believe it. Because what he's saying is what a lot of Russians are saying
Really think, right?
and Russians, what's that?
That's probably what they really think, what they wish they could say, right? He's giving
Yeah.
voice to that.
Yeah. So I do think that people should not dismiss anything that Vladimir Putin says, which is always positive and looking to the future, to a better world, a peaceful world where everybody benefits. And then you have Medvedev coming across as this belligerent bull in a china closet. but he keeps reminding the United States and NATO how close they are to the unthinkable.
Yes.
Where Putin, well, he's talked about the missiles that we have and that we need to completely avoid this direct confrontation because of the unthinkable. But he puts it in much more soft and polite terms than does Medvedev. All right. Now, I want to get back to the United States of America.
No, you don't. Don't come home. You
No,
don't want to come back here.
I don't think I can. Given
That's probably a good thing.
given the films that I've made and the work that I'm doing, trying to expose the truth about Russia and the Russian people and Russian politics as I've seen it through my eyes, I don't think I'd be welcome back there. But
You mean
I'm
in the
always,
land of free speech? You wouldn't be welcome in the land of freedom of the press and free speech?
look at just like you, my first YouTube channel was deleted, 550 films and videos wiped clean because they didn't like what I was saying. Facebook banned. Anyway,
I got banned from Facebook too. We have that in common as well.
there we go. We got 2 medals. We each have 2 medals.
I guess I'll be joining you in Russia soon when they kick me out of this country.
Let me tell you this, in terms of freedom of speech, I had friends that told me before I came here in 2016, turn your telephone off, turn your Bluetooth off, and do not say anything in your hotel room because they will be monitoring everything you do. And I thought, yeah, I don't think that's true. You know what? It's total insanity. Russians have more freedom of speech than anybody in the United States do. You do not go to jail because you speak out against Vladimir Putin or the government or any of its policies.
And yet they tell us just the opposite here in our Western media.
Just the opposite. Just the opposite. There are people that have television channels, independent television channels that are not controlled by the Kremlin, that are anti-Putin, anti-Russian policy on a number of issues. None of these people are jailed. You can't count the number of Russian bloggers. Many of them obviously pro-Russia, but many, many, many are anti-Putin and many of his policies, and they remain free. But I have to tell you this, Lori. Putin's favorability rating since the start of the special military operation has been in the 80th percentile. I have to tell you, people here, they don't just like him, they love him.
They love him.
In spite of many internal problems, domestic problems that Russia has that are yet unsolved, one of them is the problem with pensioners. They do not receive a pension that allows them basically to survive. And there are other problems of inequality, but that's everywhere.
Sure.
Nevertheless, what I'm interested in is in the United States, not that there isn't any freedom of speech, because we've been affected by that. I want to know, Lori, this war in Ukraine, I have stopped calling it a proxy war. It is a direct war between the United States of America and Russia. The stated goals of the President of the United States, Lloyd Austin, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, is to take down and destroy Russia and to remove Putin, to balkanize it. The RAND report says exactly the same thing, okay? So this is a direct war between Russia and between the United States and Russia on the playing field of this poor country, it is a poor country now, of Ukraine. I want to know, Lori, is the narrative beginning to change in the United States regarding the war in Ukraine? I'm reading here secondhand reports from the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, Politico, and the Guardian that are beginning to show cracks in the United States narrative favoring Ukraine, wanting to continue the war, continue the spending. I'm reading, and I can see here there are cracks in the EU and NATO. Prime ministers and presidents now are speaking out against more aid to Ukraine.
Finally.
Lord, oh, yeah. From Czechoslovakia to Hungary to Slovakia, Serbia. And they're beginning to be riots in countries and mass demonstrations because the people here are across Europe are suffering so badly from the sanctions that were imposed on Russia that backfired. They're suffering so badly that their unelected representatives in the EU have sacrificed their interest for their own political power and gain, siding with the United States in this war against Russia.
Absolutely.
Is the narrative beginning to change in the United States? You are a journalist with a 35-year career history. What is your take on the narrative in America, whether it be from the mainstream media or from local media or from just conversations with people that you have in Norman, Oklahoma?
Well, I will say, as you pointed out, a lot of the mainstream media outlets are finally, a year and a half into this war, only now starting to admit that, yeah, there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. Yes, there's a corruption problem in Ukraine. You know how they developed amnesia about the corruption problem in Ukraine that they used to write about a lot before the special military operation. Then they forgot all about the Nazi problem and the corruption problem. Now they're starting to talk about that again. Yes, the tide is most definitely turning. We saw that play out in Congress, in the House of Representatives this past week. And as far as the people go, I will say this, you're not seeing as many Ukrainian flags flying outside of people's homes. You know, when this war first began, we call it a war over here. I know you call it a special military operation. We Yankees just call it a war. But, you know, there used to be Ukrainian flags flying outside of every other home because, I don't know, the government told us it's a good war and Russia's bad. And so we have to support Ukraine. And so all these stupid Americans just started waving the Ukrainian flag around, even though they didn't understand anything about the background of this war, how long it's been going on. They didn't know anything about the Maidan coup or, you know, the intricate politics behind it. All they knew was they saw it on TV and it's a good thing. So rah, 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 let's go to war in Ukraine. Not our guys, of course. I mean, we're not going to send our sons and daughters because Americans are inherently selfish and we really are tired of war after the last 20 years. Ever since 9/11, we've been at war on several fronts around the world. The last thing that most Americans want is another war that we have to send our kids to. So, you know, this situation suited a lot of Americans just fine as long as our boots weren't on the ground. I hate to say it, but they were okay with Ukrainians fighting and dying over there as long as we were not. But once they started to feel the pain, the financial pain, after a year and a half, and they see these ridiculous sums of money going to Ukraine. And people are finally starting to ask why. What is this for? Why so much? Why is the bill so high? Why is the cost of everything through the roof, whether it's your utilities, your heating, your air conditioning, your water bill, your trash bill, your grocery bill, your rent, your mortgage, interest rates, everything is through the roof. And they're finally starting to make that connection in their heads, Regis, that, oh, it's the war spending. That's what's causing this tremendous inflation. And it's just to the point where it's unaffordable now for the average Americans.
You know,
That's when we
my
get mad.
my good friend Bruce Gagnon, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yes.
He's the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He's been an organizer since the 1980s in Orlando, Florida. So all of his really adult life, he's been at this. He has underscored this point. It's all about the money. It's all about the funding, and the funding that's going to war over and over and over again. And I think, Lori, this particular point cannot be emphasized enough. My dad always used to say, Americans vote with their pocketbooks.
We do.
And I think if my dad were alive today, he'd be experiencing exactly what you said. I would be experiencing exactly what you said, not being able to afford anything.
Yes.
And I hope that the pain that Americans are feeling now and are going to continue to feel will be the thing that maybe opens their eyes as to where and what the problem is. All of this war spending, over $1 trillion a year on war. And when they just say, oh, no, the military budget is just, 800 billion or something, baloney. NASA is a dual purpose entity,
Right.
civilian and military. All of the 21 or so intelligence agencies are all funded. It's a war funding. The NSA. So when you put it all together, it's over $1 trillion. And I just read today that the United States has spent over $2 billion on Ukraine since before the coup in Kiev, Maidan, in 2014.
Sounds
And
about
Biden,
right.
it was pretty damn close, I'll tell you that. I've heard 187 billion, but now Biden wants to give him another 100 billion in some kind of secret backdoor deal. If Americans could only understand what the financial, economic impact is to them and their families and their generations to come, I have always hoped that they would rise up and throw them out. Okay.
Me too.
Okay. Listen,
Me too.
you mentioned Nazis in Ukraine.
Mm.
I was in Odessa in 2016 and I saw them. We were there a few of us foreign journalists were invited by the mothers of those who lost their lives in the massacre in the Union Trade Hall in Odessa in 2014. I was one of 3 Americans who went, and we were there to protect the mothers who were observing the second anniversary of the massacre, because they were afraid of the Nazis who would retaliate against them. Yeah. And they figured, well, with an international group of journalists, filmmakers, which is what I am, they would be protected. Well, indeed, they were. But we saw them everywhere, right sector people. They threw rocks at our bus. And when you're living here in the Russian Federation, Americans will call it propaganda. There is so much hard evidence. I'm talking videos on YouTube, on Telegram, on Twitter, showing the Azov battalion and the other Nazi battalions with Nazi swastika Nazi emblems tattooed on their bodies and patches on their arms, and Zelensky appearing with these people.
Yep.
And so, in talking about this Nazi problem, let's now shift to Canada. The
Let's
scandal
do
that
that.
happened just last week. I know you've talked a great deal about this on your own show and other places.
Mhm.
This scandal in in Canada, has had to get the attention of the Canadian people, if nobody else. I mean, it's worldwide scandal. This is all over the world, front page news everywhere.
Everywhere.
Do you
Except
think,
Canada. Except Canada.
well, that's what I want to ask you. Do you think that people in Canada or the United States becoming aware now of this Nazi problem? What are your thoughts?
Well, Regis, I think it's actually pretty awesome because of Nazigate in Canada. I don't think it's a coincidence that their Speaker of the House had to resign in disgrace. And within 1 week, our Speaker of the House also had to resign, basically, and was kicked out of power. And in both cases, in both of our countries, it's about Ukraine. It's about the people realizing not only is this a money pit, an endless, deep money pit, but there's also a Nazi problem that we're actually funding and arming Nazis. The Yaroslav Hunka affair, we were live on Maverick News when it happened, because it was a big deal that Zelensky was visiting Parliament. And so on Maverick News, we had the video going live. At the time, we didn't know who he was. Just thought he was some elderly Ukrainian Canadian who was getting an honor for something. But when the speaker said that he was a hero of World War II who was fighting the Russians, I mean, that gave me pause. I said, wait a minute, hold on. I know who fought the Russians in World War II. Wait, he must have been with, the other guys, the Waffen. Turns out he was. I took that Saturday, that this happened on 2 Fridays ago. And I spent the whole day Saturday trying to find out who he was, what his background was, ran across a blog, which was basically his online memoir that Yaroslav Hunka published. And it shocked me. It really shocked me. He wrote about being a teenager growing up in this small village in Western Ukraine, not far from Lvov, and, dreaming of being in the Waffen SS. They were heroes to those kids, They had recruitment posters in their gymnasium and in their schools, and they were trying to recruit the youth, the teenagers. So when the time came in 1943, he couldn't wait to sign up to join the Waffen SS. And he writes glowingly in his 2011 memoir of how proud he was of his men, of his service. He said next to nothing about the Holocaust, just danced around that completely. And even now, he's still so proud of himself. No apologies, no contrition whatsoever. And when you saw him in the Canadian Parliament, when he stood up and they're giving him 2 standing ovations, what did he do? Yeah, he gave it this. He gave his fist. He's like, yeah, we won. Like, to him, this is a great victory for Ukraine. But it isn't. He might have been a hero of Canada for a minute, but as soon as everybody figured out who he was not a hero anymore. And now the question is, what do they do about it? What do they do with him? What bothers me, Regis, is it's been 15 days now since that happened. And to date, there has still not been, proper accountability. There have not been proper apologies. There have been some kind of empty apologies and non-apologies, and then Trudeau turned around and blamed Russian disinformation for what we all saw with our own two eyes. What, did Vladimir Putin make that guy show up to Parliament? Did he make Justin Trudeau meet with Yaroslav Hunka in his private quarters with Zelensky? And Zelensky has not said one word about it. Not one word. Because you know how he feels about it. He probably considers the guy a hero too. But he can't say it out loud. So it's all been, kind of delicious to watch the fallout, to watch all these politicians scramble. But I'll tell you this. If every member of the Canadian Parliament really didn't know who was fighting who in World War II, as they claim, I mean, they seriously claimed not to know that he was with the bad guys. How can you not know who was fighting the Russians in World War II? Then if they're that stupid, then they should all resign because they're clearly not qualified to do their jobs and they shouldn't be in the Parliament. So I say that Justin Trudeau must resign, Chrystia Freeland must resign, and I want to see all 338 members of Parliament resign, Parliament dissolved, and elections called. Not only that, I want transparency. When Rick was on your show, he was telling you about the Duchesne Commission, which was, I think, in the 80s and early 90s. And it was supposed to be sort of their truth and reconciliation moment, but not much really came of it. As he explained to you on the show, they had some war crimes trials, but by that time, the guys were old and frail, and they basically got a pass. Canada didn't deport their Ukrainian Nazis. And, there's something else. It's important to note that at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, 1947, you notice that there were no Ukrainians prosecuted at Nuremberg. It was only Germans. The Ukrainians got a free pass and passports. And they were taken in by the British, and the CIA adopted them because they thought they'd be useful in this new Cold War that they were brewing against our former ally, the Soviet Union. And it's interesting to me how the Ukrainians totally got away with it, and yet they were some of the most brutal and savage war criminals of World War II. I mean, they did things that would make the Nazis blush. They were some of the worst, and yet they got away. Not a single one of them was prosecuted at Nuremberg. And also, as Rick explained on the show, British intelligence and the CIA essentially made Canada take all these guys because Britain didn't want them. We didn't want them. And so we said, hey, Canada, you take him. And what choice did Canada really have in the matter, right? Canada, unfortunately, has always been in a rather subservient position to the United States. And when the CIA tells you, hey, we want you to take, all these thousands of Nazi war criminals, you do. They did, whether they wanted to or not. And now they have the largest Ukrainian diaspora outside of Eastern Europe and a very powerful lobby. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. It's been around since 1940. And this organization had a lot to do with lobbying the Canadian government after the war to accept a lot of Ukrainian nationalists into the country, because they are a Ukrainian nationalist organization. They have tremendous power, very close to Justin Trudeau, also to Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the so-called opposition. But they're not really opposed to each other, Regis. They're in perfect agreement. The conservatives, the liberals, they all agree that Russia is bad. Russia must be defeated. glory to Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, and they seem to really like Nazis until they got caught. I mean, I look at the Yaroslav Hunka Nazigate scandal as a blessing in disguise. Look at the fallout just in 2 weeks' time, right? Their Speaker of the House had to resign. Their entire government is a disgrace right now, and the whole world knows it. Canadians know it. Canadians are starting to ask some hard questions of their government. Rick, my Canadian colleague there at Maverick News, he explained it very well when he said your average Canadian really doesn't know because it's just one tile in their cultural mosaic in Canada. The Ukrainian community there is large, but they tend to kind of keep to themselves. And your average Canadian had no idea about this stuff. And unlike the United States, I will say something good about my country, even though our CIA brought these guys over to the West and what they did was despicable. But at least in the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, we had a pretty good Congress in the 90s. We passed some good legislation in terms of transparency. We passed the JFK Records Act in 1992. We also passed a law in 1998 called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. And it's because of that law that we now know the whole story of what we did, what the CIA did with the Ukrainian nationalists after World War II and in the 50s and the 60s. That's a blessing. Canada needs something like that. Canada needs transparency because what Canada's been doing all these years with Ukrainian nationalists has been kept secret from their own people. And it all just blew up on the floor of Parliament 2 weeks ago. I think you couldn't have handed a bigger win to the anti-war folks like me who want this to be disclosed. And I hope that the Canadian people are not going to let this thing go. I hope they keep the pressure on their elected politicians. I hope they keep the pressure on their government. The government just wants it to go away. They want the news cycle to move on quickly. But there's still no transparency. They're still withholding documents from the Duchesne Commission. And the Canadian people have a right to know. They should demand it.
Lori, I agree. I think the mask has come off in Canada. I hope in the United States that some additional masks will come off because of this.
Me too.
That American people, in spite of that legislation, are completely unaware of Operation Paperclip and the role that these former Nazis have played throughout their government for the last 78 years. I don't know what it'll take. That information is certainly not being taught in schools. It's not in the history books.
Well, it's there, Regis, but the problem is most Americans don't read.
Yeah,
that's been my experience anyway.
And what they call people like you and me, conspiracy nut jobs, Kremlin assets, blah, 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 blah.
Because we read history.
Lori, this has been great. Thank you so much for getting up early and coming on the show.
My pleasure.
I hope we can do it again real soon. There's so many things that I would like to visit with you as a professional, longtime reporter, and involved in Kennedy's campaign. Although as I've said before, I don't follow this stuff on my show. I pay attention personally, but it would be really great to have you back again.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed this. I've wanted to talk to you for the longest time. We have so many friends in common. And may I just say that I pray every day for the continued safety of the people of Crimea. And I hate to see these increased attacks, increased in number and severity and frequency. I pray for you guys every day, and I hope you stay safe. you and your family.
Well, thank you. But you know what? I don't pray much anymore, but I believe in karma and I believe in positive energy. And when many of my friends in the States say, I am safer than you are in the
Hmm.
United States, and
Right?
not just because of crime, but because of all of the threats you are projecting on me, you are vulnerable to the same things.
We are indeed. And I think most Americans don't realize it yet.
Yeah.
Yet.